All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather. Francisco keeps changing the name of this talk, so you'll see a different name in your books and on these slides. But it is vaguely about brand. So Helen talked a little bit about Portuguese modesty, and I will mostly be here to tell you to not be modest if you're trying to build a brand. So let's get started. So you know who I am. I come from a company called IDEO. We started about 40 years ago in Silicon Valley in California. And we're probably most famous for designing the first commercial mouse for Apple, the first laptop, a number of different products associated with early Silicon Valley. And largely what we do is we partner with ambitious leaders and disruptors that are looking to change their organization, their products, their whole category. We work with, I would say, most of the top 500 to 1,000 companies in the world, really rethinking their innovation strategy and their customer experience. My particular role is that I run our retail and consumer products portfolio, which encompasses luxury goods in beauty, fashion, home goods, hospitality, food, owned retail, experiential retail, third-party retail. And what that really looks like day to day is often companies looking to start a new chapter in their organization. Maybe there's a generational change in leadership that's looking to change the positioning of the brand. Folks looking to enter a new market. So say you wanted to take your brand and launch it in China or something like that. Or folks looking to just design a new product, a new service experience, or an entirely new brand. So that's the kind of work that we do here today. And I do that for everything from supersonic flight. Boom Aerospace will be relaunching the Concorde for commercial use in about 6 years now, to global luxury beauty with international celebrities. And I've been involved in the ground-up creation of a number of new brands, as well as the revitalization of luxury brands. So I felt okay about this remit Francisco gave me about how to build a brand in a global context. But as I said to him, this isn't really just about brand. This is about luxury brands, which are a very specific subset of brands. And I actually believe they're probably the purest and most ultimate form of brand. I also think they're the most fun to build, and I've kind of built a few. But as the first speaker here today, I want to set some definition of terms. These mean a lot of things. What does luxury mean? What does brand actually mean? So I do occasionally teach at Harvard Business School and the Harvard School of Design. So I'm going to put my professorial hat on here to level set by what we actually mean by these terms when we're thinking about building a truly global brand. So you'll see a number of, we'll kind of start on luxury, we'll go into brand, we'll talk about the strategies of luxury brands, and then I'll talk about some things that are happening in the world in terms of tactics. So our first question is what is luxury? So at the outset, luxury is an industry, right? We're all here today because we're in the luxury industry. It's comprised of, food and beverage, fashion, perfumes, cosmetics, vehicles, hotel, travel, watches, jewelry, retail. There are probably entirely new categories of luxury experiences, particularly in the digital realm, that are yet to be created. And economically, it's quite large. So in 2000, it was around a $125 billion business. It's projected to be about a $700 billion business globally. Helen and I might have slightly different terms here, but what's a few hundred million between friends? She also talked a bit about, and let's see, the kind of headwinds that this sector has faced, although they do really need to be seen in context. I would say over the last 25 years, on average, the luxury business has seen a compound annual growth rate of over 5%. And the reason you saw such exponential growth rates in these companies in the last 2 years in the financial markets is simply because the baseline dipped in 2020. So even last year, 2/3 of all luxury brands in the world still had a growth year, even facing economic headwinds. Here you can see this in the kind of global context. This is really a long game. So you see a little dip in 2020 and then kind of straight back up. And luxury brands tend not to be fly-by-night. They're often hundreds of years old. So as we think about going forward, I believe there's still plenty of opportunity in this space. So what kind of created the tremendous growth in the luxury market over the last 25 to 30 years? So much of that compound growth was driven by two things: the opening up of the world, which is something Portugal has helped with throughout history, and also increasing levels of wealth fueled by technology-driven production increases. So very simply, there are more rich people in number and in percent of the population in the world than there have ever been before, and we can access them in more places. Now, much has been said about the role of China in driving the growth of this luxury market, and that is an important luxury market. About 20 to 25% of luxury sales are in China. But it is not the only game in town, and that growth has been slowing. There's plenty of opportunities still outside of the tier 1 cities, and even in countries like Japan, which was the main luxury market in the early 80s, has seen a great rebound, almost 20% growth this year. And actually a quarter of all of LVMH's stores in Asia are in Japan. There's also a lot of new places to start looking. So if you follow the luxury market, they tend to emerge quite predictably in places where GDP growth is accruing to the upper middle class. And so what are those places where we can start to look for growth now? So many new brands where they're looking for new sources of growth are looking very specifically to these places given their economic indicators. So South Korea is one of the largest emerging luxury markets, Brazil, India, Nigeria, South Africa. There are a number of others, but it very predictably follows kind of baseline economic growth. But that doesn't actually tell us what luxury is. It just talks about it a bit as an industry. So for the next bit, I'm going to think about luxury spend. Now, I think I have somebody from BCG in the audience that's going to be in the next panel. There you are. So I have brought up some numbers from your last Altagamma report. When you think about the distribution of customers, who is really buying luxury goods? When you distribute it, there's probably 10 categories of them, but the most important are at the top and the bottom. So the group at the top who have, they spend more than 50,000 euros a year, sometimes on order of 350,000 euros a year on luxury goods. They have coined them the kind of beyond money group. They only make up about 0.5% of the luxury consumer population, but they do drive 20% of the value and the spend. And they're very economically resilient. Downturns tend to not affect that spend, and targeting them can really help in kind of building brand and stability. Your volume is going to come from actually the lowest end of that segment, which is your aspirational segment. That makes up about 90% of the consumers and 60% of the spend, which is why you often see this kind of high-low strategy of a few iconic products that are almost economically unavailable to many people, kind of supplemented by a group of things that are more accessible. But just because something's expensive doesn't make something luxury. Now this might be like a little bit controversial, but I'm going to talk a bit about the difference between a premium product and a luxury product. So I would argue, for example, that Apple, while an amazing brand, is not a luxury good of any type. It is, in fact, a premium good. So how do we define the difference? You define the difference in a premium good, you spend more, you get more. Right? You buy a more expensive iPhone, you get more storage. Now this, some people would quibble with me, but in many luxury goods, you spend more and you don't actually get more. Sometimes you get less. And there's no real difference in functionality, between the bag that I might get, despite, there are, of course, differences in quality and artisanship that we'll talk about. But in terms of pure functionality, it's not actually very different. And it's actually a very specific class of goods, which is called a Veblen good. So Thorstein Veblen was an economist in the late 1800s who wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class. And he is the person that coined the term conspicuous consumption. And he defined a category of goods called Veblen goods that have a very particular and peculiar quality in that they invert the law of supply and demand, and they have an upward sloping demand curve. So they're the only products for which demand increases as you increase the price. I'm partial to this definition from Coco Chanel that says, luxury is a necessity that begins where necessity ends. And if you look to the other end of the spectrum, someone maybe less artistic, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, said people are never as ready to spend a lot of money as when they don't need the purchase. So I think when Coco Chanel and Adam Smith agree, I'll align myself there. All right, so that's all well and good about what luxury might be, but luxury is also a strategy. right? And it's not the same as a fashion strategy, even though we often conflate it a lot with fashion brands. Fashion strategies are more temporal and more about tribe creation versus elevation. But what is kind of that strategy? I actually highly recommend this book, The Luxury Strategy. I do not receive commission, but I think it is an excellent book if you're thinking about that. But even if you look at the subtitle, around rules of marketing to build luxury brands, it's effectively a strategy that is entirely about building brand. Now, some of the things contained in this are very interesting, I think. I pulled out a few of my tops, and they're kind of called the anti-laws of marketing. So everything you might normally do to market a premium good or a regular good, you do the opposite of when you are trying to market a luxury good. For example, you dominate the client. Yes, you want to listen to what they say, but you want to make it hard for them to actually get the product. When you advertise, you don't actually sell the product. There are plenty of luxury brands for which people cannot name a single product that they sell, but they still have a sense about the brand. You generally don't feature stars or influencers in your advertising. Many of them don't sell on the internet. Chanel still does not sell clothes on the internet. And you market to people that are never going to buy your product. There's all sorts of strange things. I put this last one at the bottom, do not relocate your factory, since I think it speaks to a competitive advantage you have here in Portugal. But when we think about this strategy is still fundamentally about brand. So what is a brand? Okay. So I like to look at the definition of brand from Hamilton Helmer. He's a famous strategist. So he's defined that there are 7 things about a company that can build competitive, sustainable advantage over time and have you be more profitable than your competitors. So many of the things are things you think about more classically in economics, like, for example, scale economies, like Amazon, or network economies, like LinkedIn or Facebook, or counter positioning, like Tesla, or switching cost, or cornered resource. But brand is one of those powers, and he defines it as a business that enjoys higher perceived value to an objectively identical offering due to historical information about them. The benefit is you can charge higher prices due to this perception, and there's a good barrier to entry, which is that it takes a significant amount of time to build a brand like this and to build the fundamentals of that brand. To pull up Coco Chanel again, I think about this in brand. I decided who I wanted to be, and that is who I am. It is largely an invention. So let's kind of break this down a little bit more specifically. What is brand? There's many kind of fluffy definitions of brand. I kind of like this one, where I think about brand as the things that people say about you when you're not there. And it's this kind of intuitive feeling built over time. And the example I have on the right is something kind of strange and difficult to explain. It was a meme that kind of went viral last year at this tomato, and they're like, this tomato is so Loewe. And I bet, so some of you might get that, some of you might don't, but there's a sensibility about this tomato, okay? And what are the components of kind of creating a sensibility like this? So you have your foundational brand elements. Right? You think about the mission of your company, why you exist beyond making money. And you think about the promise that you have to customers. What are you selling, right? In Hermes, it's really a kind of craftsmanship and a heritage. And you think about how that's positioned into the market and to the market of your competitors. So when you're initially creating a brand strategy, a brand architecture, these are the things that you want to define: a promise and a positioning. These things will never be market-facing. You'll never say them to your consumers. They're not the same as a tagline. Usually when you have this basis as your strategy, then you start to build on it through your brand identity. This is what most people associate with brand. What does your logo look like? What do your products look like? But you'll generally make a pretty comprehensive brand book that has everything from your personality, what's the tone of voice that you communicate in, what's the type of music that gets played, what type of service principles do you follow. All of these things, what's your photography style, tend to be communicated in a brand book that you can play with a little bit, but is meant to form a kind of strategic underpinning so that everyone you work with is kind of rowing in the same direction. Right? Never creating things that are off-brand. However, much of that still no one will ever see. The things that people actually see are your brand expressions. So this is how it actually finally touches the consumer, and it touches the consumer in many, many ways more than your product, often which are more important to brand building. From your digital experiences, to your service experiences, to your product offering, to your retail experiences, all of these things influence how the customer thinks about you in their mind and starts to kind of build the brand. So if I was starting from nothing, that's kind of the strategic underpinning that I would start to build. So think about my strategy, think about the expression, or think about the identity, and then think about the expression. Right? So if those are the components of it, though, what are we doing? What's a luxury brand? Any brand could be associated with that. So when I think about a luxury brand, there are three things that you can fundamentally compete on. There's a kind of Maslow's hierarchy of branding. So the first thing you can compete on is price. Right? Someone like Amazon competes on price. The second thing you can compete on is value. We think of a lot of electronics companies think about this. They call it like the silver runway when you walk into a store and try to pick out a stove or something like that. And then the kind of final thing you can compete on is emotion. And that's what luxury brands really compete on, is emotion. I found this interesting. This was a study done, it's kind of old now, but it's pretty everlasting, where they surveyed luxury consumers in 6 different global markets to ask them, like, what words did they associate with luxury? And yes, they all said high quality and expensive. That's kind of table stakes. But the other words are kind of interesting. Words like pleasure and dream and intemporal. Right? All of these things that almost feel like they can't be created, but can be created. So what are we really trying to do? I think in a brand, you need to be connected to your customer. You need to know them, not because you're going to deliver exactly what they want, but you need to know what they aspire to be. What do people hope to be? What do they dream of? What do they want to be? What is the life they wish they could live? And then you hold up a mirror where you show that image back to them for just a moment. And the basis of this really is a kind of concept of customer centricity, to be really obsessed with kind of understanding that customer group. There's a theory of luxury brand management that says your role of managing a luxury brand is to define very, very tight boundaries on the clientele for which the brand will build its association off of. And even later, as you start to expand to more clientele, it's actually the original clients that you need to think about and retain and how they're evolving and kind of what the things they want are evolving to be. All right, so what things are kind of particular to luxury brands? There are usually 5 evergreen qualities that apply to most luxury brands. And I say this because I think most of them already apply to people in this room. You have a lot of the core components that make successful global luxury brands. So the first one we've talked about a lot, quality, devotion to quality. And that means outside of product, it also means service. Every kind of touch point that you might have, simply obsession with the finest detail around quality. That's a little bit distinct from craft, which is also important. Now, something that's particularly valuable is when something is branded as a unique or endangered method of production, something that would otherwise be going away if you were not sustaining it within this luxury brand. So that's why brands often have craft prizes, right? There's a Loewe craft prize, there's a Bottega Veneta craft in motion film series. LMBH actually invented the term endangered crafts and started the Heritage Craft Association, where they pledged to employ 25,000 people under 30 to emphasize the underrepresented trades. So thinking about not only how are you kind of selling the goods made with craftsmanship, but how are you advocating for craftsmanship and artisans in the world and in the global economy. You also have a feeling of exclusivity. I say feeling very particularly because that is not a reality. Louis Vuitton in the late 70s only had 2 stores, and it sold $12 million a year. Right? Now it sells over $1 billion a year, and you can't really say that it's scarce. Right? You can get them in many places, but it still has a feeling of exclusivity about it. And heritage and provenance. You see Jane Birkin originally creating the Birkin bag because she could not fit her straw basket in the overhead bin when she was sitting next to the chairman. And this is a lot about authentic relationship to place And we learned a bit about what that kind of authenticity and uniqueness of Portugal might be. It's also kind of Europe more broadly when you think about international markets. But when you're trying to create a durability of desire, you're really selling a sense of place to people that live outside of it. And you have to create what that sense of place is in their mind. And the last item I would say is artistry and design. And I separate those two things as not being the same. Because the kind of relation to art, if you think about art on one end and commerce at the other, luxury brands are the closest to art because it is the creation and the selling of pure emotion, which is why you'll often see this kind of dedication to a high art, even if that doesn't necessarily translate into what people buy day to day. So those are some evergreen qualities of luxury brands. We can all agree that's what luxury brands feature. We have many of those elements today. But things are starting to change, and managing a global luxury brand is more complex than it has ever been before. And our demographics are changing a lot. So yes, about 90% of people that have ultra-high net worth are still over the age of 50, but younger generations are starting to redefine luxury experiences. So Gen Z's purchasing power will reach about 30% by 2030. Millennials are already over 50% of the global luxury market. So the rules of brand building for these folks are changing, and they require less of a kind of singular mentality that I spoke about before, but more of a kind of tension. And you have to hold these tensions in your mind at all times and kind of think about how we're holding these ideas in a harmonious tension. So let's kind of get into some tensions and trends. So the first one I would talk about is exclusivity and access. This is where we're talking about the feelings of scarcity. And nothing enables you to do this better than leveraging modern media. And I think our friends at TikTok will be talking about marketing strategies relating to this later. But you can leverage modern media to kind of generate these feelings of intimacy, these feelings of desire, while actually maintaining a fair amount of exclusivity beyond price. So if you think about people that have done this very well recently, you think about Formula One, which was not at all present in America. We were a NASCAR nation through and through, all until there was a Netflix show on all of the drivers in Formula One. And now it is attracting even more people than our Netflix races attract. You also think about how the kind of insane process of buying an Hermes bag has played out on social media. And people are constantly posting their quests and what their sales associates are offering them. And you can follow these things like mini dramas that are kind of unfolding online. But many of these things are kind of manufactured. So a kind of leveraging of media is one way to create this. You also see this very much in the kind of quiet luxury trend that has been talked about a lot, and like, why is that important? That does also maintain this line, where there's a sense, kind of the if you know, you know. It maintains a sense of exclusivity through a kind of protected knowledge. Even if a lot of people have that knowledge, it's a kind of sensibility, right? And this is part of why in the initial luxury strategy, it's so important to communicate to people that will never buy your product, because someone has to want to buy your product and can't, so that the people that do buy it feel better about themselves. So your marketing has to be a bit more broad-based than simply marketing to your consumers, and you're really storytelling to the world and to the market at large, even if they won't necessarily all buy your products. The next tension that we think about is heritage and modernity. So a deep commitment to craft, it's a necessary condition for luxury, but it's not a sufficient condition. So this is one of the moves that you'll see LMVH do all the time. As soon as they buy a brand, if it's, they did the same thing with Louis Vuitton. They put in place Marc Jacobs as soon as they bought it. When they bought Loewe, they put in place their creative director. This is kind of the move that they make. When they bought Tiffany's, they immediately did a campaign about this not being your mother's Tiffany's and wearing them in kind of strange ways and juxtaposing them in things. So how am I kind of rooting in history and place, but showing up in kind of unexpected and diverse places. This kind of tension or contrast between these kind of pixelated clothes from Pharrell's Louis Vuitton installation and the kind of richness of the background. So thinking about where are we kind of always holding these things in tension. You see this in the Gaultier show in Paris, which had this very kind of dramatic, theatrical, turn-of-the-century vibe, but the materiality of it is actually very strange and almost alien-like. Right? And you'll hear this, and the chairman of Hermes often says, we are not a museum. Right? And even though we're built on heritage, you must kind of continue to juxtapose yourself against the new. One way that people actually do this is by creating what we call affinity supergroups. So this is what you will see in a lot of collaborations, when the collaborations are maybe not even necessary. So when Loewe collaborates with Spirited Away, or McQueen collaborates with the estate of Hieronymus Bosch, you'll see these kind of Bjork wearing these Kineomora, like crazy masks that are then also juxtaposed and made into digital lenses that you can buy on Facebook. These are a way of having a kind of vibe by association. So it makes your brand kind of an ecosystem that is participating and communicating in culture and lifestyle to help you kind of start to really create culture less than be kind of a branded piece of content. So often something that we'll do when we're thinking about a brand is we'll ask people these questions. If your brand was a car, what would it be? If your brand was a movie, what would it be? And you start to think about this kind of association by vibe. The next thing that we think about a lot is kind of this tension between singular and broad. So you used to have a luxury where you could build desire in a brand and then match people to the product after that. But we have kind of moved to a world where you have these iconic viral products, and often those things introduce people to a brand, right? To continue to talk about Loewe here, yes, they had a kind of 10-year build under their creative director to becoming more culturally relevant, but most people didn't hear about them until the puzzle bag started showing up all over social media. So you have these kind of few exceptional products, even if most of your profitability comes from a mass product. And part of the derivation of this, I think, actually relates to this trend where our younger consumers, particularly millennial and Gen Z consumers, really do think of themselves as collectors. And this is because they're often raised on these kind of streetwear culture drops, right? And very much so, rather than consuming a piece, we're thinking about how we're kind of collecting this piece. The next trend we like to think about is the tension between being indulgent and being responsible. So there's a kind of wellness aesthetic, very kind of defined by what we call millennial pink. And I think we're moving past that in a way. And what we're seeing in very exciting luxury brands is this kind of transformational euphoria. It's like kind of magic and intensity. And this is really pulled from the art world. What you see in the bottom is one of the retail stores from Gentle Monster. It's an eyewear brand that also does, now I believe, it owns a couple of brands that also do luxury makeup and scents. And they actually just put straight up art installations. And there's these very kind of like weird, strange worlds that they create that are simply about association. And that I hold a little bit in tension with this notion of trying to still be responsible. So, this is a picture of the Qatari artist who works to create screen prints with Dior, right? So you have this kind of back and forth between we're both trying to be responsible for the world that we have while being very escapist and departing from it, right? So when you look at this, a recent survey said 61% of consumers want brands to help them feel intense emotions. They want to feel magic and escape and kind of technicolor superlatives. And you see this playing out against a couple of realms. So this is some hospitality in Tokyo where you see these very like insular escapist worlds. Or Annie Leibowitz's campaign for Montclair, which was very much about like magic and illusion, but like somehow also building in a climate narrative. So you see these type of things. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention that as the kind of younger generations get more purchasing power, they do care about you being responsible and a responsible steward of the world. There's a very interesting travel company up at the top where I can't even say their name, but they kind of curate these like regenerative travel trips. You'll see a lot of broad-facing media about this, but it's less about my products are sustainable, if that's something I want to be, more about how am I actually driving change in the world and a sustainability agenda. So simply, I think making your product responsible is really not enough here. And you have to kind of turn the corner if you want this to be a differentiator into how am I advocating for this in the world. And the last one I'll talk about, which is also going to set up our friends on social media next, is this idea of control and participation. There's probably no one that tries to hold tighter control of their brands than luxury brand managers. Right? And you have this very, you want to have the message and you've set the brand strategy and you want to tightly control it. But even our most visionary brands today kind of have to relinquish control over their messaging, and they have to participate in online conversations that add a bit of wit and levity to the brand. So on the right, you will see Justad Guy, who is the most popular luxury influencer right now, but mostly a totally invented personality, but now is, I would say, the top spokesperson for Audemars Piguet and Loro Piana. And what you'll see on the left is a kind of strange conversation where Sophia Richie was shopping with her husband, Elliot Grange, and they saw this Loewe boot, and he said, "This boot looks like a rich duck would wear it." And so what did the brand start doing? They started selling ducks, right, in this kind of conversation that you will have, right, with folks. So these are some things that are starting to kind of sit on the edges of where people are positioning their luxury brands. So that is mostly what I was hoping to do today, is just kind of level set. Like, what are we really talking about when we're talking about luxury and what we're talking about brand? But it is ultimately something that is, entirely created. It is something that kind of deeply relates, I'm going to skip that one, to kind of artistry. Well, you'll find most successful companies that execute this strategy do have a dual leadership structure. If you think about like Tom and Dom at Gucci, where there's a kind of business person responsible for the business, there's an artistic person responsible for the artistic direction, and they kind of don't get in each other's business and let it go, and together they kind of create this world. Last night I was reading and I came upon this Kafka quote that said, "To believe passionately in something that does not yet exist is to create it." And I think that's really the essence of creating new brands.